This is Duke University.
The film that we're going to see is a film called The Past Is Not Our Future, and it's the story in many ways of Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney was, as he himself called himself, a revolutionary intellectual. Meaning he was both an intellectual and historian of great excellence and reputation. He published a foundational book in African history called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is still regarded as a classic today for sort of breaking a whole new direction in the historiography of Africa. But he was also a revolutionary. He was a person who eventually left the academy, left a job as a historian at a good university, to become part of a political opposition group in his native Guyana, and began to organize, mobilize to get support to overthrow the Forbes-Burnham regime in Guyana in the 1970s, and was eventually assassinated at a very young age. He was only 41 years old when he died. That iconic Walter Rodney that I just mentioned, that revolutionary intellectual, is not what you're going to see in the film. What you're going to see in the film is the origins of that person. What concerned me very much in making the film was thoughts about who Walter Rodney was. How did he begin to develop these ideas that would inspire his intellectual course and then eventually inspire his revolutionary action? What was it about that early period when he was, very much like the majority of the people here in this room, an undergraduate student studying at the University of the West Indies, a privileged student, because then as now to get access to tertiary education in the Caribbean is still a fairly rare thing. Still a small percentage of the population actually gets the privilege of going to university. He took that privilege very seriously, and it was during those formative years of his undergraduate career that he begins to develop this revolutionary idea that would sort of transform him. So that is the focus of the film. That is what I really wanted to capture in the film. Rodney, of course, would become very much influenced later on by Black Power, and in turn would influence Black Power developments in the United States as well as the United Kingdom and across the Caribbean. But I'm really trying to understand what was it about that moment in Caribbean history when Walter Rodney was a undergraduate. That's that period of the late 50s into the early 1960s that would inspire him and motivate him on the life course that he would eventually choose.
Can you tell us the inception of the film, like why you decided to make it in film form as opposed to maybe writing about it, or why? Because it's the first film you've made, right?
Right.
Yeah, and what brought you to that medium?
The story came to me visually. I didn't think of it any other way, but a visual story. I was very interested in understanding, Walter Rodney's life and career, and how it was that he sort of, developed into the kind of person he became. And I thought that there was I just saw it. I didn't think of actual text. And so that's what got me started. Now, I didn't know how far it would go. I thought that the film originally conceived would have sort of tracked his whole life. But as I started to dig into the archives and look for stuff, I was really fascinated how much material I found of his years as an undergraduate. I mean, all the stuff that you hear there, the narration is stuff he wrote when he was between the ages of 18 and 20. I mean, he was incredibly prolific, and also somebody who was really plugged into what was happening in his environment, really a deep thinker. And I felt that was the part of biography that is often sort of glossed over, what I like to call the becoming, that we sort of go to when the person is formed, and when you see the Walter Rodney, that's the kind of iconic Walter Rodney for us in the Caribbean, which opens the film, right? Giving a powerful speech, sort of being recognized as this, this very important revolutionary figure. But then going back and trying to see and find from those fragments in the archives the sort of material that created that was really fascinating. And so once I started on that journey, it just kind of kept going. And then trying to tell the tale visually was a whole new area for me. but then also trying to think of how it can be done in a somewhat spare way, without too much on it. And I felt that required a lot of thinking through and looking at it and conceiving what that space of the university campus would have been like in the early 1960s. And the familiarity of that space, which we now take for granted, because there's so much built environment around where the classrooms were that Rodney would have attended. And trying to sort of visually lock into that in a way where it sort of not only takes you back to that point in time, but also makes you appreciate that was his world, and it was in that space that he began to develop a lot of the thoughts that would guide him.
In California, he had an affiliation with the leaders of the Black Panther Party.
Yes, I believe he did, and I don't know concretely who he had affiliations with, but I'm glad he mentioned the U.S. connection with Walter Rodney. It's very significant. In the 1970s, Rodney so he came back to Guyana, his home country, and was denied a job at the university there because of his political views. Rodney easily could have gone to universities in the U.S. or universities in Europe or the United Kingdom. I mean, he was an exceptional scholar. And if anybody here did the math on the information at the end, he was 24 years old when he got his PhD. 24. And one of the things we discovered in doing the research when we went into the archives, that there was a massive multi-volume history of the Caribbean that was being drafted by all the pioneer, Elsa Gavaya, Roy Auger. These are all pioneers in Caribbean historiography. And it never materialized, but we did find the first draft of it that was made at a meeting in 64. And they had Walter Rodney down to write one of the essays. So think about, this is just 1 year from undergraduate that they esteemed him and his capabilities so high that they felt he could do this. He rejected all of that life to become involved in his revolutionary activism. And when he couldn't get a job at the University of Guyana, what he would do was that he would travel to the United States and give guest lectures, sometimes seminars. So California was one place he went. He spent some time in Michigan as well, spent a lot of time at Cornell in upstate New York. Various places across the United States he gave guest lectures, and it was on the honorary he received from those guest lectures. That's how he and his family could survive. But he was determined that he was going to stay in Guyana and build something there for his WPA.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the archival sources that you used, and especially, I think it was called the Spoken Word Library?
Right. Okay. The Library of the Spoken Word is the collection of recorded material we have in our UWI, University of West Indies archives. So I went through that quite a lot with some assistance from the librarians there, and we tried to find whatever material we could. And in that search, we didn't find, like we would see, for instance, reference to something being recorded, and you go into archives, there's no surviving tape. But that trolling through it made you discover wonderful gems, two of which we used in the film. One, which is Norman Manley speaking just before the referendum, which failed, which ended federation. But he was so confident in that speech that the idea of a united nations of the Caribbean could come together. And the other one was the C.L.R. James lecture, which was great to hear C.L.R. James in that period, because C.L.R. James had, this is a quick footnote, sorry. C.L.R. James had a terrible car accident a couple of years after that, a very bad car accident, just I think only 5 years after he gave that lecture. That affected his speech. So if you look at later, or listen to later interviews of C.L.R. James, there's a slight slurring of his words. So when we actually discovered a recording pre-accident, which is actually the earliest recording we have of C.L.R. James giving a lecture, that was a great little nerdy thing for us that we were excited about. The state of it is good. I mean, they've really done very good work in keeping up the Library of the Spoken Word collection, which is something we continue to do. When we have guest lectures come to the university, we record them and it's archived there.
So there's a moment in the film where it speaks about educational reconfiguration, educational policy infrastructure, and I wanted to know if if there were particular specifics that Rodney was thinking of in that area.
Right, that's a good question. To the film and to that time period, he definitely was speaking about decolonizing the education system. That was crucial to him and to people of his generation. I hope this translated well for everyone here, the sort of historical moment that the film captures. So in that 3-year period, an undergraduate degree in my university is 3, not 4 years. And in that 3-year period, 1960 to 63, Rodney is there witnessing the collapse of Federation. He mobilizes with students to march to support it. Doesn't work out. The Cuban Revolution in its very, very gestating early phase, and he goes to Cuba, as you see in the film, and that has a huge impact. And independence in Jamaica, among many other things. That is sort of invigorating this sense of nationalism and regionalism within him. And so his idea of a decolonized educational system is one in which the Caribbean history in particular would be taught to Caribbean students. At that point in time, it wasn't. You could only learn Caribbean history by going to the university and doing Elsa Govaya's course, who was the first person to start teaching Caribbean history in 1951. That's how you learned Caribbean history, but it didn't make it down to the high school level or anywhere. In fact, one of the great things, when you do work like this, is really fascinating because you interview a lot of people, more than appeared in the film, because some just didn't want there to be in the film for personal reasons. But one of the persons we spoke to was a high school classmate of Walter Rodney's in Guyana, who said that one of their teachers had been to Jamaica and took Elsa Govaya's classes, and Rodney, at 15 years old, wanted so badly to learn about Caribbean history, he would get his teacher's notebook from when that teacher was an undergraduate and transcribe them. And in the process of transcribing those notes into his own notebook, he was learning a lot about Caribbean history. The history department at that point in time was so colonially shaped that a head of the department would never be chosen among the faculty members. That person would be brought in from Oxford or Cambridge to be head of the department. The first head of department that we had, who was a Caribbean person, wasn't until 1964. So up to the time Rodney left, all of the chairs, most of the people who would have been the faculty would have been people coming in from England. So if you put those 2 points together, this emerging nationalism, this sense in Caribbean pride with what he's seen around him, you can see why he becomes so devoted to the idea of decolonizing the curriculum, but making it go all the way down to the high school level, which would still take a long time to be realized in the Caribbean.
Rodney talks about how he wants to kind of de-Europeanize the university.
Yes.
And then he describes how he feels the students are slightly depressing. Just now, in terms of the climate of UWI, how would you describe it?
It's very different from when he went to school there, went to university. Very different. First of all, it's much larger, the student body. Back then, it was a very elite institution. To get access there, you had to be very bright, and Rodney was super bright, brilliant. Somebody once said to me, if the highest you could get on a test was 10, Walter Rodney always got 15, right? I mean, he was really just remarkable. So it was, it was a very, very narrow population. And what he was looking for were people who were thinking like him. Now, then and now, a lot of the student body was concerned about careers afterwards and protecting class status. And to be a student there and to get a degree from that institution gave you a real strong leverage in these emerging nations of the Caribbean. It's changed so much now because it's a lot more democratized. That happened around the period of the 1980s, where you began to sort of see an opening up of the university so people from different class backgrounds could come in. Another thing that's changed a lot since Rodney's years there, is that it's a lot more, the universities are a lot more national, meaning whichever country. The University of the West Indies, by the way, has 3 physical campuses, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados. Back then, it only had 1 campus in Jamaica. So if you're a bright student from St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Barbados, and you wanted to get a university education, you had to come to Jamaica. And the majority of the population, the student population then were non-Jamaicans, up to about between 60 to 70%. Now you're looking at probably 90% Jamaican. And in Trinidad, same, 90% Trinidadian, Barbados, the same. So that's made a huge difference. So that sense of the region and that sort of connection to the region, which was very much part of how they were taught and how their own identity developed. You don't really have that anymore. That's a big change.
Why do you think it was important to make a movie about Walter Rodney in the 20-teens and release it now?
I think for me personally, connected to that is my own thoughts about youth today and Caribbean youth in particular, which is the space I know the best and that I occupy. And it was a concern that there is a lot about their history, a lot about the way in which history matters, that is not as strong and as important to them as it was for my generation and generations before me. And so that was a concern of mine. And that was one of the things that made me think that a film like this, speaking to this particular iconic Caribbean figure when that person was a student, is important. The title, "The Past Is Not Our Future," captures for me the sense of vibrancy of independence, the sense of charting one's own course and sort of, moving away from the colonial pattern. There's an interesting story with that title too. It comes from a poem written by Mervyn Morris, who's a former poet laureate of Jamaica, a great poet, who wrote that in 1962 in a short poem he had called The West Indies. And when we were doing the archival research for the film, I discovered that Walter Rodney actually cited that in one of his student papers, which we insert there. And then I went to Mervyn, who I know, and I asked him, did you know this poem? I've read a lot of your poems before in your published books. I've never seen this poem before. And Mervyn didn't remember it. He wrote that poem 56 years ago and had no memory of ever writing that poem. And when I showed it to him, he was so surprised. And he says, "Where did you find it?" I said, "Well, I found it in a student paper Walter Rodney wrote." Then I asked him if he would go into the studio and I could record him reciting that poem. And he obliged me, thankfully. So that's what opens the film. But for him, it took him back to that period when he was a very young man and what independence meant to him at that time, enough to inspire him to write this poem.
Karen, I was wondering if you could speak to maybe why his literature has not yet, I guess, fully been absorbed.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the historiographies that you're reading, because his work is cited quite a lot in, as I said, in Caribbean historiography. His work is still heavily cited in African historiography. That book has been cited. What's been interesting for me, I've been screening this film at many different university campuses across the US and in the UK. And it's interesting what audiences bring to the discussion. And there are some people who knew nothing else about Walter Rodney but that book. So it's very interesting in terms of the life of that book in the different populations and the impact of it. So that's the only thing they know about. Well, they didn't know he was Guyanese, or that he spent his time in Jamaica, or that he was revolutionary activist and so on. So I think that, I do think that the work still has a strong life. His other things that he wrote were a history of the Guyanese working people, which is a big book in understanding Guyanese historiography. He just last year they published a history of the Russian Revolution, which he wrote. Another famous book by him is Groundings with My Brothers, which is more known in Jamaica because it's about his time in Jamaica than elsewhere. So, it depends on the sort of spaces you're in, but I think the book does have a life. I will say a very interesting footnote, and I think it speaks to Walter Rodney's commitments. When he went to London as a student at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he got his PhD, he stayed a lot of that time with a Guyanese family. a man named Eric Huntley and Huntley's wife. And Huntley had started a very local press in London, which was really aimed at sort of black power publications called Bogle Louverture Press. When Rodney finished his big work, his master work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he gave it to Huntley to publish. He didn't go to a university press. He didn't try and shop it with any big name trade press. He says, I want you to publish this book, which says a lot about his, as I said, his sort of commitment to what he did.
In your opinion, would you say is the reason behind why students now have a lack of caring about history and the past?
I have several thoughts on that, and I'm going to give one or two of them with great caution. And I say that because I really think that students need to speak for themselves. I think that they have their own issues and their own causes and their own attachments that I don't necessarily understand, because that's not my particular space, so I cannot judge it and say that they're uninformed. They just have different ways in which they're expressing themselves and choosing what they support. What I will say, though, is that I think that we've suffered in the Caribbean heavily from a very traumatic history. And one of the consequences of trauma in the Caribbean has been migration. A lot of families have been fragmented, have been separated. A lot of migration has happened across the region. Places like Haiti, very well known, a lot of the history of Haiti that's happened in the past since the mid-20th century. To present, which has sort of amplified a lot of out-migration in Haiti. Jamaica suffered a traumatic history in the 1970s, 1980s. Guyana has suffered a really traumatic history as well. And I think that as a result of that, the way in which the past that led to that is sort of factored into conversations is as baggage. And that you need to release that baggage if you want to have a chance in your own life. And I think that has been part of it. And so, when certain issues are raised in my classes with students, I sometimes do get students who say to me very clearly, I don't want to know about that. That's not really helping me get to a different place. I don't want to judge it, because I know that they have their own immediate traumas, their own immediate things that they're dealing with. But many of my students that I teach in Jamaica have families overseas. And, I have a routine question that I ask a lot of my students in class. At some point in the semester, I say, how many of you, when you finish your degree here, would like to go live in the United States? And most of them put their hands up. So the sense of belonging is very different. At that point in time, this was the Caribbean space was a space in which people felt they had a stake in. I mean, that speech, which was another great gem we found in the Library of Spoken Word, which for me was just so exciting when I discovered this, that Eric Williams gives in 1963 at Walter Rodney's graduation ceremony. Wow, what a speech. I mean, so riveting. And you get a sense that for somebody like Walter Rodney, anybody hearing that as a Caribbean person leaving to go away, you feel empowered. You feel that there's some responsibility you have to the region and as a representative of the region. That is very emboldening. And I think that was very significant. And even though Eric Williams' political career, one could critique and so on, he definitely took a very different direction, very different views by the late 60s. But that period in 1963, so fresh after independence, and that charge that he leaves with everybody, I think is monumental.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.